Welcome back, everyone. This is part two of our exploration of greatness. And this really is the one that I have been waiting for because if you've been following along with us, we've been on quite a long journey at this point on a sequence of exploring our concepts of freedom, flourishing, and greatness. We've had two episodes for each of these, and now we're finally at the final episode for greatness. And I do believe this really is the summation of all of these, because as we've tried to explain in our theory that we're developing about this, that we really do see that flourishing proceeds off of freedom and greatness then even builds up upon flourishing. And so this really is the synthesis. And what we're doing in this particular episode really is creating our own metasynthesis of the synthesis. If you tuned into part one, you definitely should before you see this one. We explored a whole bunch of different case studies just to essentially put those on the table from which to induce a unified, comprehensive, great theory of greatness. And that is what we are going to do today. So I'm going to turn it over to my co-host and co-founder, Chris, for a moment. And would you like to share what we have in store for us today? Get us started?
Yeah, no, and I like you, I am similarly so excited about this episode, and for the very reason you just stated, it really is a culmination, um, and in many ways a climax, kind of our ultimate answer of the what for of philosophical liberalism and what we're aiming towards, and we are going to tie it back even to the freedom dimension and what we're building towards on the political moral ideal. Um, and I think another thing just that's interesting to note here, we talked in the last discussion, part one, on greatness about how it is an edge concept, that it's not really well understood. And that's why we drew on so many case studies, real examples of real people in the world to try and start to induce some general principles and themes. I think we did a great job of starting to tease some of that out in the last one, and we had over 30 people, I think, in total. But one of the things that stood out, I think, for both of us, at least certainly speaking for myself, when we looked at each of those individual cases, is that they often reflected maybe just one or two aspects of greatness. And oftentimes, then, even the way we think about great humans is we think about them in kind of one aspect of extraordinary achievement that they create. And so it kind of has a monolithic concept. But I think our vision of greatness, similarly to our vision on flourishing, if you listen into those two pieces and the ultimate ideals that Joy and I put forth, is that it is multidimensional, and that part of core central to this ideal that we're trying to build on both concepts is that we know so much now, we have so much capability in our modern age, our modern liberal or semi-liberal age, that we're trying to make more free, through this whole initiative and all of our life's efforts here. Um, that we can really see the holistic capacity and just expansive glory that can be human life. And so our what we're going to try to aim for here is a multi-dimensional aspect or ideal of greatness. So and I think that's, frankly, I think that's kind of new ground, because it's certainly, even when we went searching for this concept, the little that there is, like we said, it tends to be more monolithic. So, and then our method to even getting to what we're going to talk through today about our kind of meta synthesis or grand unified great theory on greatness, will reflect that.
And I think it's important to emphasize too that as we're laying out what we're going to consider the different dimensions of greatness, that there is a real way in which every person goes on their own journey. I like this metaphor of thinking about everyone is on their own rocket ship, and your rocket ship through space is going to take you through all of the different dimensions of greatness. But that journey is ultimately going to be your own. And it ties into another important point, which we tried to stress even in the last episode, that we do believe that greatness is difficult, it's demanding, it's challenging. It asks us to draw out the best from within all of us. But that said, it is open to everyone. And I definitely do see greatness as a journey. That's even part of what this vision of greatness entails. That even though this episode is in a sense a climax, it's not the top of a peak because the mountain just keeps growing, I guess, in this analogy. There, you never reach the summit. Although you certainly reach certain heights, the heights just expand and expand. Which why I think even sort of the idea of like infinite expanding galaxies is a beautiful
Well,
metaphor
I,
for
I
what we're trying to describe here.
I was going to say, or kind of the multiverse in a way,
Yes.
to kind of carry on with your wonderful, progressive, future forward metaphor and or analogy here. So yeah, and I totally agree. So and so just to give a little bit more background even on our method of how we got here. So after kind of as we said, we started with even our emotional appraisal of what greatness meant to both of us, and then from that we built out and looked at a bunch of concrete examples of great men and women in history and tried to draw out some lessons from that. And then Joy and I each kind of went into our own corners and built on and or refined some of our own thinking on this concept that we've done prior to this project, and that this project has really galvanized us to kind of hone in on. And then we also availed ourselves of the newest in tools and technology and utilize both ChatGPT and the Claude models. We like to kind of play the two off of each other. They're two of the leading ones, just to even see how different firms with different technologies and different language models and kind of how they come up with different answers. So, and we both availed that tool to sharpen our own theories and kind of even let the AI help us come up with a grand synthesis of some of its own ideas that it came up with, and then each of Joya's and my respective ideas. And so what we're going to go through is represents the metasynthesis between our work of the metasynthesis of everything we've talked about the last two sessions, and then even really everything we've talked about in the last six sessions. Gosh, I can't even believe it's been that many, on our three core values of freedom, flourishing, and greatness. Um, yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, and I think it's absolutely appropriate and beautiful that we really have leveraged these greatest of tools that are available to us because one of the things that I think we've discovered as we've been going through this that what all of the greats have done, all the great humans, the great human process has always been an iterative process. As you're saying, it usually starts with an intuition and emotion. Just that's how our cognition works as human beings. That it starts that system one level of what the rapid fire response to something is. And then you iterate on it. You use your logical, rational brain and you start asking questions and gathering evidence. And it goes through a spiral, it goes through an iteration. And now I think what all of these great tools allow us to do, they're not replacements for the human. They just augment and empower us to achieve that much more greatness because what we have done through this process is to even just feed it some of our reflections and then go through more iteration. Have both, we've used ChatGPT and Claude in this instance to give us feedback. And then you and I have taken that and used it to feed more into the systems and synthesize that even further. So what we've finally got here is sort of the grand metasynthesis from multiple iterations of the humans and machines working together. So I think we really do have a very great system of greatness that we are about to share.
That we do. So we'll dive right in and to continue with the galactic metaphor and the future forward metaphor. We have our unified master theory of greatness has seven dimensions and then a fundamental meta principle. So effectively eight planks, but really seven dimensions in the meta principle. So we're going to go through each one, talk a little bit about them, and then we'll end on the meta principle, and then we'll just reflect on some other ideas and considerations that our concept or kind of gave rise to in us. So starting out, and I would just say that like one of the key takeaways or kind of even how we did this is we draw, you'll see references or echoes to some of the themes that we talked about in the last one. But we really try to just kind of integrate the elements that we found being most significant. And that's really what came out of both Joya's and my individual ideals, and then even the iterative process with the AI machines. So, in many ways, we see these as, kind of at least the seven most significant, seven plus one most significant dimensions in our vision of greatness. But it's not necessarily comprehensive, or at least completed. And we see this concept as even something that we're going to continue to iterate and build upon as our own knowledge and experience grows over time. And certainly that we want to hear from all of you all, your uh, ideals and ideas on this concept, and what you think we might miss or might want to add or subtract, whatever. So that's just kind of a word on kind of where even we stand now. We're not necessarily presenting this as the final word on greatness by any means.
Absolutely not. The universe is expanding, and the universe of greatness ought to be expanding along with our knowledge and understanding of greatness is also just ever expanding. So let's just dive in and start to explore the first dimension.
Great. So dimension one is what we call grand ambition and the greatness journey. So the key insight here is that greatness often begins with an intentional choice to be extraordinary or to respond extraordinarily when greatness is thrust upon you. It can be accidental, that's a discovery of latent gifts within you. It can be created consciously by pursuing a chosen path, or it can be forced on you by circumstance. So there's a little bit of kind of a greatness journey here, but that it results in a grand ambition, which is something we talked about in the prior discussion. So that's kind of the essence here. And recognizing that you are allowed to aim high, kind of accepting the call when it comes, however it comes, to take your place among the best. So with that, kind of what would you like to add onto
I
that?
do think this idea of ambition is key, and it's perhaps the one that I want to beat the drum about the most because it's the one that I think is most lacking in, let's just say, our everyday cultural conversations about what matters in human experience, that we should be centering ambition. We don't enough, and it really is the first thing. And to your point, that even in these situations where might say the circumstances thrust greatness upon you. It's Shakespeare's phrase, right? That some men are born great, some have greatness thrust upon them. But even in those situations, for example, some of the exemplars that we looked at. So, for example, like a Frederick Douglass who found himself in situations of dealing with slavery, or Viktor Frankl in the concentration camp. Think of how many other individuals were in those same circumstances and just they were obviously victims of that, but there's also a way in which they brought a mindset to rise above their victimhood. I mean, Frankel's beautiful statement that the last freedom you always possess is the freedom of how you respond. And I think I want to tie this in and say that we want to respond with ambition. We want to respond in a way that really sets as a goal, as an intention, and really as a commitment, to use Dan Sullivan's language, to really make it our commitment to do something great, to have that ambition. And not enough people do, and more people ought to.
Here, I couldn't agree more. And I think this is why we even drew out one of these themes, even you could see it even in the first discussion on greatness here. And to me, this even goes back to our painter's poems where we started on this. If you listen to the first one, you'll recall that I had defined mine as greatness being the highest heights of human achievement. And to me, this even starts to distinguish greatness from flourishing, because there's no doubt ambition implicit and embedded in even many of the planks of both of our respective ideals on flourishing. But I think the language here in this dimension one and greatness of grand ambition is key, because it's the grand part. It's almost um, the scope and scale of your ambition is wider and bigger than yourself, maybe, is what I would add to this notion of ambition, and specifically contrasting it with maybe the lesser forms of ambition. Not, but I don't mean that in kind of a moral judgment kind of perspective, but just uh smaller in scope or scale that flourishing entails.
Yeah, and I think it is important to recognize that even as we described flourishing, that flourishing itself is never the easy path, that flourishing requires challenge, as we discussed, and you can definitely go back to the previous episodes if you need to see that. So there is a way in which flourishing itself is an achievement that ought to be commended. But that I think
Absolutely.
you're right, that greatness goes beyond that. And so two ways that I think about this. One, I think there is this concept of pushing limits. So when we're talking about ambition, there is a sense of perhaps personal ambition of pushing your own previous limits. And in that sense, always attempting to work your edge, as they often say in fitness, but it applies to all areas where growth
Mhm.
is possible across life. So to essentially be trying to work your edge, to always be trying to push your limits. And I think what we've seen that the greatest of the greats have done throughout history is they have pushed humanity's limits. They've pushed our sense of what is possible for humanity. So I think that is the grandness of scope and scale as you're describing it. And then also to tie this back with the idea of the importance of having a mission. And so we saw that as key and central in flourishing, that Maslow pointed out that the self-actualizers were all of them people who had a mission that, as he put it, was outside of their own skins, something bigger than yourself, as we perhaps say in common parlance. But here, what we're suggesting is that greatness even requires you to have that mission and to think about it in this great scale and scope of size.
Yes, and the only kind of caveat or nuance I'll add to that is, um, and we'll touch upon this in the next few dimensions, but um, I would not say that this ideal of greatness that we're describing and sketching out, that it that the scope of ambition needs to be world changing for all people. Like, so, even though many of the figures that we've cited are obviously all actually world famous and world impacting figures, and that helps us draw out some of these themes and principles. That's not the standard necessarily that one has to reach. I think the key is just that like you just said, Joya, that you're going beyond even kind of your day to day or your everyday or even just the level of achievement you've already achieved, and that you see it as you can always do more. So
Exactly. I would even tie it into the beautiful observation you drew out in our last episode, where all of your examples of greatness were all about expanding and expansion. So I think that just captures this idea of you're always trying to push whatever the current limits are, whether they are your own personal limits or maybe they are the limits of your family, your community, your state, your country. And then maybe it is just, worldwide, global, timeless, what is possible for humanity. That is the greatest of the greatness.
yeah. So then we move into our second dimension, which we call self mastery and integrative excellence. So, some of the key insights on this one is that greatness it's not only what we do out in the outer world, but equally importantly, what we make of ourselves in our inner world. So it comes from often that project of mastering yourself, your mind, your emotions, and your habits in particular, and it also integrates the various aspects of human existence. So our moral, material, intellectual, and spiritual dimensions, and really also seeing that a truly integrated person needs to unite their thought, actions, values, and emotions. And then also, even, and this gets back to even one of our first episodes about what is philosophy, and having a clear philosophy and seeing that that is often a guide, as we talked about in that episode, to integrating all these aspects of your life into a coherent whole. And I would argue that that's even then the means, but by providing a coherent whole, that's the means by which you achieve mastery over yourself. So, that's kind of this second dimension. I'll turn it over to you for additional thoughts, Shoya.
The only thing I would add or really emphasize is, again, I think it's important here to note that self mastery is another one of these concepts where it's not just a one and done, or you finally reach the destination of self mastery, that self mastery itself is part of the ongoing journey. And then the same thing with ambition, that I think is you and I have even experienced in our personal lives, that I think we each have been people who, even as children, always pushed ourselves to do something ambitious. But as you grow and you learn and you actually work toward that ambition, the ambition itself starts to evolve. So I think the real point here is to start and to work on the evolution of your ambition, and also the evolution of your self mastery. As you kind of pointed out, sort of all of the domains of the self that you do need to work on mastering so that you can actually go out and achieve this grand mission that you have set for yourself.
Yeah, and I guess the other 2 points that I would want to add on this is, and I love what you just noted because, well, it's really 3, but you covered it, so I won't double back other than to note that uh, oh shoot, I just lost my train of thought. What was your last point there?
Just emphasizing the fact that it is the journey that
Oh, that's right.
in
So it's, yeah,
mastering all of
self-master.
your
It's not
domains in order to achieve
that's
the
right.
goal.
It's not a destination, that I think it is an ongoing evolution and project, but you know, one way in which I think you can, even when you start to say, okay, well, what does that mean? How do I know if I've achieved self-mastery? And I think of it as like an internal governance, that it's when you're at a point of being able to practice discipline, self-regulation, emotional intelligence, you know, clarity of your priorities. These are all other manifestations of what that means. And obviously those things can all change over time, and even the way in which you apply them to specific circumstances and in people and relationships in your life is going to change from context to context. But it's recognizing consciously and then practicing regularly all of those things for kind of your internal self-governance. And then, so that's, I guess, the second point. And then the third point is just, when I think of integrative excellence, it's also this notion, and this even ties back to one of the planks of my ideal of flourishing, the Magnificent Seven that I walked through 2 episodes prior, about the Renaissance human ideal, which we talk about even in our vision of philosophical liberalism. I think there is something to striving for part of the another manifestation of that grand ambition and drive is striving for excellence in multiple domains of your life. We talked about in flourishing that part of what flourishing is recognizing that there are so many different aspects of human existence: health and fitness, family and relationships, love and romance, exploration and artistry, work and productive creative endeavors, all of these different dimensions. And that the more you can apply yourself across all of those, the more flourishing you're going to have. And then I would say integrative excellence at the level of greatness just takes that to the next level of kind of the further Renaissance ideal. We looked at people, the literal Renaissance humans, where the concept comes from: Leonardo da Vinci and Angelo Buonarroti. I don't think we all have to be a Michelangelo to be great, but again, they spoke to something that is potential within human beings and human existence, that is just another great ideal that we can strive for, as we look at kind of pushing the limits of human greatness and potential.
And again, this is just part of the ambition. It's the ambition to strive in all of these areas and to actually put in the effort to try to make it happen.
Yeah. So then our third dimension is what we call purposeful creation and creative transformation. This is going to sound familiar because I think this builds off of our creator trader pursuing continuous betterment ideal, and this notion of the centrality of work that we've been talking about. But at the heart of greatness here, this to us, I think, is really about making something new, whether it's art, technology, science, organizations, social movements. As we talked about, it's just any creative effort of making something new in the world that reshapes the world in alignment with your own higher values. That it's not a passive commentary creativity, but it's an active transformation guided by your personal vision. So setting high standards in your work and creative pursuits, and then aiming for novelty and alignment with values, I think is some of the core insights here.
Again, I would just say this is another one of the dimensions where unfortunately our culture fails us somewhat. That we say the word creative and we think, oh, we're just talking about the artists, or maybe now even in our day we think like, oh, that just means like, oh, like one of the tech bros or something like that. Like a Steve Jobs was incredibly creative with technology, but we really are seeing technology as a capacity that is available to all humans and that we all ought to be leveraging. That it's part of the grandness of the human experience, and that whichever domains, and to your earlier point that perhaps we even ought to be pursuing creativity in multiple domains and having that high ambition that we bring to it, to constantly ask how can we reshape ourselves and the world around us in the image of our values and do that in ever growing scope.
Yeah, I love that. And one of the ways I like to think about it is technology just boiled down to its essence means doing more with less. That's what it is. And to me, that's really what work is about, like, kind of, and human creative power as such, that when we talk about why it's so central to our purpose, that it's the way in which we survive and thrive. And I try to kind of stake a claim for the vision of it's not merely surviving, but it's thriving, and particularly it's a specific kind of thriving, which is transforming the world around us to make our lives better. And so, to me, technology is just the physical, kind of concrete material manifestation of that impulse and that effort. So, yeah, again, that to me is doing more with less. To your point about we all can utilize technology, that's what it is. It's a tool to augment our abilities so that we can all do more with less, and that's the basis of human progress, really.
And it's interesting how when we're able to do more with less, we are able to be more. I think that's
Yeah,
even what we're seeing with the evolution of humanity. That
that's
as
right.
through our agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, and this grand technology revolution that we are all living through. So who knows what people hundreds and thousands of years from now are going to call this exact moment that we're living through. But whatever this is, that what we're going through now, it is going to make it possible for us to do more with less, and what that means is what it gives us. Well, this is almost like a little sneak peek preview to what we have coming up. But what it ultimately gives us is more freedom, more choice to enable us to be more. But I'll just leave that little teaser for where we're going next.
Well, and as this entire project and this very concept of greatness uh, entails or illustrates to this very point, right? That in many ways we're at the leading edge of defining human greatness, because it's only now through being able to do more with less and all the progress we now are stand on the shoulders of, that we can start to see all of the potential of human life. So here to that. Our fourth dimension is what we call grit, perseverance, and the joy of challenge. So the insights here are that greatness is not about perfection. We talked a little bit about that in the prior discussion, and I wholeheartedly, can't emphasize that enough, because I think that's another area where the common cultural understanding of greatness, insofar as that it exists, tends to go awry or just misses a lot. Is that it thinks that it is perfection. Um, but what it is about is the relentless capacity to rise through challenge again and again, pick yourself up, learn from mistakes and failures, both of which are a part of life and not a bad part of life. That's how we learn. In fact, they're usually, you talk to most people, whatever spectrum of life and scope of endeavor and ambition and reach that they're operating at. And they'll usually say their most impactful learning lessons were from mistakes and failures. So that is actually a key truth of human existence, that greatness, our theory of greatness, embraces, and in fact even stresses that hard challenges can be fun, that adventure and curiosity are what can fuel our persistence to work through and fight through and struggle through, yes, hardship and mistakes and failures and disappointments and all of those inevitable and innate aspects of human existence.
I would absolutely say challenge can be fun, and more than that, challenge is necessary for meaning. I'm just going to tie this back to what we've discussed earlier about the concept of flow and what flow is. It's defined as that optimal state of human consciousness where you both feel your best and perform your best. And what we know about flow is that it absolutely requires challenge. It's where the challenge and skills meet, the challenge skills balance. And then there is this ever rising, that you build your skills in order to reach up to and meet greater and greater challenges. So it in itself is the iterative growing process, but it's what we need actually to flourish, and then also to have this concept of greatness that depends on flourishing. And to your point that when people sort of misunderstand what greatness is all about, where they think it's all about perfection, or they think it's all just about, let's say, their career, and that if you pursue greatness, that it's going to lead to burnout and stress and dissatisfaction, which is the exact opposite of what we're talking about here. That for us, the great theory of greatness has to incorporate humans as a whole. And I think even tapping into what we know about flow, that when you feel your best and perform your best, it's even just a fascinating fact about the human experience, that these actually come together, and that the more that we can actually have that flow experience, that is how we feel great and achieve greatness. And so just the necessity of challenge and difficulty in order to have that.
Yeah, and I would argue that the character traits of grit and perseverance, which often are necessary to push through challenges and achieve your grand ambitions or just overcome your challenges, that they're really built through that process of working through mistakes, failings, setbacks, struggles, just even this, it doesn't have to even be a negative, but just even the striving for your values. You know, we talked about being values driven and achieving your values as a core part of flourishing. And part of why is because that gives a lot of the meaning and thrust and drive of human existence. And so, but nothing's handed to you. You got to go make it. You got to go learn it. You got to go meet and trade and create with other people. You know, all of those require effort of some sort. So even just striving is and builds that grit and perseverance that then you can draw on when when those other more negative setbacks or roadblocks and instances occur in life. So, you know, I think having the grit and perseverance is also a key part of the great response to challenge that is innate in life. And then our fifth dimension is what we call authenticity and category of one moral courage. So, what we mean by this is that true greatness demands one's living by one's unique blueprint. As Joya, I think you rightly said at the outset, you know, these are dimensions, and I even love kind of the multidimensional galactic or, you know, kind of space metaphor here because we are all traveling, we travel through every dimension, but in our own way, and each one's going to look differently. So, and that speaks to just the innate individualism of each of us, that we are truly unique and one of a kind in all of existence. Nobody else like us that ever existed before, and nobody else like us that ever will exist. It's really, I mean, just an incredibly wonderful and profound and elevating thought when you really stop and think about it. And the implication here is that we all have our own blueprint and that we lean into what's distinctively you, even if it defies norms, and embracing that and then having the moral courage to uphold your deepest convictions no matter the cost.
I like to think of your unique potential as that combination of your purpose, your mission, your skill set, the capacity that you bring, your strengths, and then also just your background and your story. And there's certainly ways in which certain aspects of who we are given to us. They're not our choice. You know, we have the genetics that we did not choose. We did not choose the environment into which we were born, but then we were able to make choices. We've had a certain life story. And I think it's important to recognize that what I'm calling your unique potential here is always dynamic. It always has this potential to change and grow and develop. But what you want to do is to go through this process to discover who you are, what really matters to you, what is it that you're really passionate about, what grand mission and vision do you want to achieve for the world, and what strengths do you already have or skills that you can already bring, and then also just bringing whatever it is that the given of your genetics, your background, your story. It creates something that is unique and special, and it is in that way extraordinary. It's the way in which all of us ordinary human beings have the capacity to do something extraordinary by really leaning into what our unique potential is. And so I think it's just another way in which we all have greatness that we can achieve and bring to the world. And I think what we're just trying to do here is to help light the fire for more and more people to lean into their unique potential and strive more toward their own potential for greatness.
And to advocate for what we believe is the reality and the truth that it is available to all of us, each and every one of us. We talked about in our ideal of flourishing, we kind of said I had my magnificent seven ingredients and you had your elite eight ingredients, and that it was kind of, you know, these were baseline ingredients, but everyone's going to have their own recipe. I think of this as just kind of building up on that, kind of that individualism. But I think the key part here is that, it's this is again about the grander scope, the greatness entails, or ambition that greatness entails. This is just taking that to the next level, that to really develop your authentic self, that's where you really have to spend the time to really get to know, like you said, what it is you really, really know and value. I mean, there's a way in which our society is rightly set up, even evolutionarily, to make things easy. And we've constructed a structure where it can be easy to kind of glide on a path of, kind of, you get educated, you go to college, you then get a career, you have your family, and it provides many of those kind of foundational values, even, kind of at the lower planks of Maslow's non-hierarchy hierarchy, that is of needs. But you can also kind of get on autopilot living that life. And so greatness is really the call to really dig deep into yourself, get to know yourself. This even ties back to the second dimension about self-mastery, and that it's really only through that process that well, you really get to know that full kind of recipe of yourself, like you said, that's your uniqueness, and that is the source of greatness. And then I believe that then once you know that and tap into that, that then you have the moral courage and the conviction to go after it and to stick with it, because it's just, once you know that level of self, it's almost impossible to unsee it, unknow it, and to move away from it. In many ways, it's kind of like moving in your spirit, if you will, and many other religious and non-religious kind of doctrines and ideologies speak to a similar phenomenon. This to me is what I think what that means in practice.
Absolutely. And I want to point out that I think it is this combination of both knowing yourself and building yourself. Because there is a real way in which there is a you that you get to know, because there was a you that was there really even before you were conscious of yourself, just kind of
Right.
how we develop as humans. So like, I mean, I even think about, I have a toddler who's 2 years old now. He already has a definite personality, but he doesn't yet have the self-awareness to know who he is. So by time he even reaches the stage of having self-awareness, there's already a burgeoning self there. And so we all have that burgeoning toddler that we have all been younger than a toddler. I mean, really, we came from the sperm and the ova coming together. We all have that burgeoning self that we have all come from. But then it's that combination of knowing it and building upon it. I mean, there's ways in which you
Yeah.
can look back at whatever your background was and say, okay, this was part of my past, but I don't want it to be part of my future. And you could definitely make choices, and you can essentially take your personal evolution into your own hands. And I think the people that do this best, when we've even seen some of our exemplars, they've done this. They've gone through the process of both getting to know themselves and then making the choices about who they are building themselves into.
It really is a multi-layered process and a never-ending one. I mean, I'll just say even on my own, creative journey, shifting from kind of that well-planned path and corporate career life that I was living, and then now moving towards a more entrepreneurial path. I thought I was somebody who knew myself fairly well, and I think relative to the average human being, I probably did, just because I've always been that way, of very kind of self-conscious and reflective and philosophical. Um, but to your point, even about knowing yourself and building yourself, I started there and then realized how much I didn't know, certainly as it pertained to and as it would manifest in what I wanted to build and make of the next phase of my creative life and productive pursuits. So that whole process was just been it's been over a year now, and it's been amazing how much new things I learned. And you're right that now that I think about it, it's not only discovering things that I valued or wanted to envision and create, but building them. So I completely, I love that, and that's a great insight.
And one more point before we get off this, because we're really emphasizing the individual here, I think we also have to remember too that we are social beings. So to your point, that as social beings, part of how we learn and thrive is by copying others, is by learning from others, and we definitely want to do that. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as the cliche says. We don't want to lose the inheritance of what we can learn from all the human beings who have come before us. So, in that sense, I think Maslow had it absolutely right when he recognized that you simultaneously want to belong, but you want to be an outlier. As he said, you want to resist enculturation while also being part of your culture. So, it's one of those both ands that's tricky to navigate, but again, to this point of integrative excellence, this is one of the polarities that I think you really do want to master, as part of greatness, is to be as a social being, a collaborative being in community with others, learning from others, and simultaneously leaning into what makes you unique and what you can uniquely contribute to make the world great, to tie it into our theme of the evening.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. That the moral courage dimension here, it only even arises because probably of this very aspect of existence, right? That we're both individual and social. As we've said, we're each our own unique individual, and that inherently makes you unlike everybody else around you, and yet we are also a social creature. So there can be some dissonance sometimes, or even oftentimes, or even all the time, between you who knowing who that self is, and then the belonging part of needing to still be in, not only needing, but getting the rewards of being in a social setting. And just the more you know yourself, the more, like I said, it provides almost that unshakable core that gives you the moral courage. And then tying it back to the prior dimension on, or two dimensions ago, on creativity, and what we talked about, kind of the specific dimension here in greatness context of creativity that's novel and new. You know, bringing anything novel and new into the world often entails disruption and change, which human beings evolutionarily were not wired to handle well. So it encounters almost always fierce resistance. And so this is just another means. This is, in fact, the primary means and dimension, this dimension of how you can do that and reconcile these competing dualities of your individuality and dealing with the wider world around you. And so then our next dimension is what we call lifelong evolution and fearless exploration. I think the first of these parts we've talked a lot about, that greatness is not a static endpoint, and it unfolds through a lifetime of continuous learning. To tie it back to our ideal of the creator trader pursuing continuous betterment. And it's equally unlearning and reinvention too as part of that process is just maybe something to add, but being open to new fields, ideas, and challenges. But then I think the second part here is maybe where we build off of the pursuing continuous betterment ideal and flourishing and go to that next level again of scope and scale of ambition and impact of the having the fearless explorer mindset that you just always seeking knowledge, experiencing growth on whatever fronts you're pursuing, material, spiritual, emotional, etc. And that you're staying fresh and trying to pioneer, to kind of go boldly where nobody's gone before sometimes, and to do that fearlessly. It doesn't mean you have to literally be Columbus setting sail out on the ocean, or kind of astronauts going to Mars, but that that quest for knowledge and continuous growth leads you to embrace the uncertainty and even the fear that comes with walking a path that has maybe never been walked before.
This is an important point I definitely want to emphasize too. The way I like to think about this is you want your actions to be fearless so that that's essentially what the world sees. But it's important to recognize that you probably will feel fear. This doesn't mean that you are not going to feel fear. Like there's that phrase of you feel the fear and do it anyway. And you
Mm.
want to be that person that is doing it anyway, so that what the world sees is that you are bold and it looks like you are fearless. But this doesn't mean that you need to somehow like I wouldn't want people to get the wrong impression that if they feel fear that they're doing it wrong, or that they should try to repress or suppress feelings of fear. I think when we've looked at our exemplars of greatness, that certainly when you delve into any of their biographies, there have definitely been moments where they have experienced fear. I mean, a lot of this involves taking risk, and I think it's a normal, natural, healthy emotion to feel fear, but then just as they say, to do it anyway, and to be bold, and to have that ambition, and to take action in spite of the fear. Again, I think Dan Sullivan has the model perfect, where he says where it starts with commitment and courage, and that's what leads to the capability, and then finally the confidence. It doesn't start with the confidence and the fearlessness. It starts with the commitment and the courage to take bold action in spite of the fear. And that's what will ultimately lead you to the confidence that will look like fearlessness in the eyes of the world.
Yeah, and this is a great point, and I totally echo it. Because I am living it in my own life. There's so many things I'm still fearful and get anxieties and have insecurities over and self-consciousness. I mean, I think the more, frankly, we can normalize these aspects of existence and be open about them and willing to talk about them, the more we can then share with each other both how we manage through them, but also grant the grace and space for this just being part of the human experience. So I,
And part of the greatness project, I think that's the important thing here too. I think we want to emphasize to people that if you actually have the ambition to go out and do great things, that fear is going to be normal, because risk is absolutely part of this process.
right.
So it's about, I think it ties back to that concept of self-mastery, and part of hopefully what you're even building in those skills of self-mastery are some of the tools to help you be able to manage the fear and be able to persevere in spite of the fear to get
Yeah,
to
and
the other side.
that's right. And I would say this is where even the self-mastery comes into, kind of building a crowning character, because through that process, even just the very process of confronting one's fears, managing them, and still pushing through to achieve these great accomplishments in life, that is character building. It builds the soul, so to speak. So, or the stuff character is made of, as they say. And just to tie it back to your point about the Dan Sullivan model, a quote I like comes from Mel Robbins. I can't remember if she actually made it or if she herself was kind of passing along from someone else, but basically said, confidence isn't the it's not the absence of fear, but it's the willingness to try. And I really loved that, because I think it kind of it's kind of another way to put Dan's model, in that, like, it starts with trying taking that step into the unknown or into the anxious and fearful and insecure, but kind of knowing all the stuff we're talking about, having all these dimensions kind of at your side, and knowing that you have the tools to face it, whatever it is. So then our last dimension, before then our eighth meta principle, although not a dimension, our seventh dimension is what we call transformational impact, from local to expanding humanity. And this is probably an apt one to end with. And also perhaps the most, I don't know, controversial, but at least uh, the widest range, I guess you could say, of application to each of our individual lives. But I think what we mean here is that greatness ultimately radiates outward to benefit not just yourself, but others. We talked even about self actualization, and then self actualization as self transcendence, being having a cause and a mission that's bigger than yourself. When we talked about flourishing, and I think this gets on that, but that, again, as we think of even tying it back to ambition, the first dimension of grand scale and scope, it's that, kind of the wider you reach, then the wider your impact is going to be to benefit others. And that can be within a small circle or at the biggest global level. But I think having that impact on others is a core component of greatness and kind of transcending oneself. So the ability to reshape entire civilizations, opening new frontiers for humanity's mind, territory, capabilities, any of those things, or even just proudly transforming, your community or a single domain, all of them count, but it's about impact. And, I would argue probably the greater and wider impact you can have, just the greater, achievement. Let's put it clearly. But it doesn't mean that everyone has to aim for worlds reaching impact, I guess. And that's I think where this one, gets a little bit more nuanced in how one applies it to their own life and their own ambitions.
Well, I want to be maybe uh, take the counterpoint and say I really think that people ought to give themselves permission to think that boldly. And I think that's even part of the problem with why greatness is not as recognized or celebrated or discussed as much as it ought to be, because I think, as human beings, we recognize that life is difficult. It's difficult even just to, you know stick to a job and get your paycheck and pay for the bills and put the roof over your head and food in your mouth and raise your family. Like, life is difficult, and it's going to throw all sorts of curveballs at you, so even just getting through the day to day can be difficult. But there is a real way in which, when you make that conscious effort to expand your horizon of concern and your horizon of activity, that it in itself transforms you to be that much better. There's that famous aphorism that I always get wrong because, as far as I'm concerned, it's backwards. I always want to say it's shoot for the stars so that you land on the moon. I think the actual person
I
who said it
always
said you were supposed to shoot for the moon so you land among the stars, but that never made sense to me
that
because if
never
you shoot
makes
for the
I
moon, the stars
yeah.
are
Oh
that
my
much farther
gosh,
away.
that's so.
So I like to say you're
I
going to
did the
shoot for
same
the stars,
thing. Oh
but
my
that
God.
there
Yeah.
is a real truth to this, that when you actually set your sight to that farther horizon, that and really commit and put that effort toward that, that it has these beneficial effects of helping you even rise above the drudgery of the daily grind, and you might actually land on the moon to put the aphorism the way that I think it ought to go. So I really do want to make the call to say that, you know, if you are someone who feels that just getting through the day to day itself is hard enough, then I want to suggest counterintuitively that you are probably not making it hard enough. Make it that much more ambitious. Really push yourself, and you will probably be surprised by what you are capable of doing. And then, to tie this back in with Maslow's point, that when you actually try to increase your sphere beyond just your own survival and that within your immediate circle, there is a real way when you have that cause that is greater than yourself, that yourself expands to meet it and you live a life that both feels more fulfilling and just in the act of who you have to become to be that person who can do that mission, you do expand yourself, you expand your complexity, you expand who you are, you expand your being, and you become both a greater force in the world for the world and have just that greater internal experience yourself.
I couldn't agree more. That was wonderfully put. I we actually don't disagree on this point. I too champion all of us reaching for the highest heights of human achievement and the widest scope and scale of ambition and impact. It's one of the things that has always motivated me in my own life, and I see the transformative impact it's had for me and the continual challenge it puts forth for me. Um, and so it's certainly the ideal we're aiming for here. We want a world of as many Leonardos as possible in the world, that it will be a better world and we will advance farther, faster, and greater than we ever have before when we reach that. And that's a huge reason why this is even kind of the ultimate summation of our three core values here, what we see as freedom kind of ultimately enabling. But I guess just, the caveat here that we want to capture here that I would note is, when you think about these dimensions and traveling through them or applying them to your own life, whatever metaphor you want to use, that it's not that if you're not a Leonardo at that world-changing scale that you haven't achieved greatness, I guess is the point. That I think when you set your sights far and wide, whatever level that is, and then you expand to meet them and have an impact on more than your life and your immediate surroundings, that is, I think, what you're talking about and what I'm talking about too, about greatness and grandness. Personally, I try to aim for the widest scale of impact, and I do want to advocate and build up a culture that inspires more as many people as possible to do the same. But I also wouldn't want people to think that, like, if they're anything less than that, that somehow that means that you're not a great human being.
Well, I think that's even what's great about the multidimensionality of this model that we're putting forward, because we're hopefully showing that greatness is this journey that you go through it in your own way, and you're not ever going to be Leonardo, and that's okay, but you're going to do your thing that is and ought to be great. And let me put it this way. So one of the most important, I love my both ands, and one
Yeah.
of my most important ones that I love to talk about is really kind of a both and, because it's the both
Mhm.
and of having high standards and combining it with compassion and support.
Yeah.
But the first point is to have high standards. And to me, that really is the starting point. Again, this ties it back to the first one and ambition. That I find that one of the greatest things a human being can do for themselves is to set themselves a high standard. And what I like to say is set that high standard and then just try to make it that much higher. And who you have to become to try to reach that standard is even what propels you through a lot of these different dimensions that we have been talking about. And you want to do it with the recognition that the high standards are high and that life in itself is already difficult, which is, I think, why it's important to have compassion for people who are going through the struggles of the journey. And that what we can do as a global society is to provide all different kinds of support for people on their journey toward high standards. So I really do think it is the both and. But I think that first one really is the key critical piece. And the if there's one message that I would hope people listening to this would take from it is what is that high standard you can set for yourself, and can we even make it that much more high, that much more ambitious? Now go do that, become that. And the very work that you have to put in, you're never going to be Leonardo, and that's fine. You are going to become an ever greater version of you. And that's what matters.
Awesome. I love it. So inspiring. And so then that brings us to our final eighth meta principle. It's actually even a poetic synthesis here because when we were talking about our flourishing ideals, I had my Magnificent Seven and Joya had her Elite Eight. So here we have kind of seven dimensions plus a meta principle, which we kind of think of, which is its own kind of fusion between our seven and eight. This one we think of as it's a meta principle because it kind of underlies as a foundation or base through all of it, or you could say it kind of carries through each of the dimensions. I'll let you, Joya, use whatever language you want to use for the metaphor here, but the meta principle here is what we call the prime mover and defender of freedom. And so kind of to take the first one, prime movers kind of accept the responsibility in their own life and to carry the world forward. You can almost think of this as like the Greek mythology of Atlas holding the world on his shoulders, but it's the project of shouldering and safeguarding and expanding humanity, and in particular humanity's potential, inspiring greatness like we're talking about here to help more human beings see through your own words and deeds and elevating others doing the same what is possible, and then critically freedom, that you are expanding freedom so that not only you but others can soar with the conditions that greatness requires, freedom being the foundational one. And that just ties into the second half of this of being a defender of freedom, that's the fertile ground where greatness takes root.
I'll just say that I think the concept and the word of a meta principle is key because it ties to our idea that freedom is both a means and an end. So, as you're pointing out, it is part of the foundation. And we've kind of even discussed throughout our ongoing conversations here how we need a certain amount of freedom, even just to get this project started. We need a certain amount of autonomy that we respect amongst ourselves and freedom in a society to just even get projects of flourishing and greatness going, but that ultimately what we're going to see is that what we get when we get to the end, as you pointed out, when we are able to do more with less, that we are able to be more. And how it is that we be is that we live a life in which we experience more freedom.
I love it. So that completes our unified master theory on greatness, our great theory on greatness,
In its current form,
in
because
its
it
current
is
form. Yes.
ever growing itself and ever expanding.
That's right. That's right. So, maybe just some final thoughts before we wrap up. I mean, I guess the first one is, well, a couple things, and you can tell me what order you want to kind of go in. I think, kind of contrasting this with flourishing, if you think we've kind of adequately fleshed out perhaps the relation, but also the distinction between the two. Um, and
I will
then
say I love the way that you put it that that here we're building off of everything that we've discussed with flourishing, that our view of greatness is a view of greatness that it entails flourishing. It's not just greatness in your career and letting everything else in your life go to pieces. So there's a way in which greatness builds on top of flourishing, but as you've put it, that it just takes it to another level, that it takes it to what you might call the highest heights of flourishing at the widest possible scale and scope. Unless there's anything else you wanted to add to that.
yeah, no, and it occurs to me when I was thinking about this distinction that, you know, I think even the ways in which we sketched out our ideal of flourishing, that in many ways they are more, for lack of a better description, they're more kind of concrete bound in terms of like things that we do and make either of ourselves or out in the world, to kind of to achieve happiness, to maximize the experience of life. Whereas greatness to me, and even these seven dimensions plus the meta principle, are almost they're like a way of living, you know, they're a little bit more abstract and also a little bit more wide ranging in their application, perhaps. So I don't really have the precise language yet, but does that make sense at all to
It's
you?
definitely a work in progress.
Yeah.
So
So, you know that, but ultimately, yeah, maybe for lack of a better word, this is one of those cases where coming back to our emotional appraisal works best in that, you know, flourishing is like human nature at our best and just kind of our everyday, you know, kind of the maximum life experience that's possible. And then greatness takes that to the next level and really pushes the boundaries of the highest heights in different dimensions. So, you know,
I
the
like
other
to think that flourishing answers the ancient question of how to live the good life and really tries to answer it in terms of all the different facets of the good, as we discussed in our flourishing discussions. But as you've pointed out here, then there is another level to take it to, which is not only how to live a good life, but how to live a great life. And it is these questions of scope and scale and pushing limits that aren't necessarily contained within flourishing, but that are there for greatness.
Great. See, there you great. Great. We've used the word great a lot, but that was actually great because I think it did a better job of articulating what I meant. So thank you for that. Um, and then, you know, I mean, hopefully, you know, I mean, I'm just filled with inspiration and excitement and ambition coming out of this discussion and just even this whole exercise of defining our ideal here. And hopefully that's inspired all of you out there listening and joining us for this. But even when I was first touching upon this topic, I did kind of raise the question of like, why does all this matter? You know, and in particular, why does it matter to this project of philosophical liberalism? You know, kind of, there's a lot of abstraction here and a lot of, you know, kind of, as we said, things that we are just not trained in our modern culture to think about, much less to work on day to day, or that it's even part of the normal human experience, sadly. And that's so that alone is why it matters to us and why we're championing it here as part of our vision. But you know, I did come up with, you know, some other thoughts here on why greatness matters. You know, number one, that it elevates human potential, you know, and that it offers a roadmap of how we can maximize our abilities and why wouldn't we want to do that? You know, that it's a driver of civilization. We've talked about this, that progress is built on just doing more with less and building off of accumulated knowledge and effort and trade and creativity. And it provides meaning and purpose. You know, I think flourishing does as well, and this just provides it at the even grander level, the self-transcendent level, to draw on one of the concepts we talked about. And we know that meaning and purpose are perhaps, you know, one of the core needs of human beings. Um, I think it's contagious. You know, I think even as this discussion it's fueled me to be even more ambitious than I already am just right by talking through it. And we hope that that will serve a similar purpose for everyone out there who picks this up. Um, and it pushes against mediocrity and conformity, which I think are often in the human social context are kind of like the equivalent of entropy, you know, kind of, which is nature's phenomenon. Um, and and then lastly, it's the ultimate form of freedom, as we talked about, that it allows us to transcend external limitations, whatever they may be, and become our fullest selves. And is in essence the most advanced form of freedom that, you know, so in this way, it is the perfect model of freedom being both a means and an end.
One of the things that ChatGPT pointed out that I loved when we were doing our iterations with ChatGPT was it made the statement that as human beings, we are aspirational beings. And I think that's absolutely true. We grow or we die, to your point about entropy. And what I think greatness helps us do is it helps us be aspirational about our aspirations. And it helps,
Hmm.
I think, push us to try to grow toward the limits of what is possible for each of us. And just really excited for even that we've done all this. And I will echo what you said that I've even just found the project, the conversation itself to be so invigorating and hopefully even an example of what actually focusing on this topic can do. That by even just being purposeful about being more great in your own life, like what can it do to help push you to do that, and then just the emotional benefits that come when you're existing in that realm. So we mentioned Ayn Rand as one of our exemplars of greatness, and one of my absolute favorite phrases of hers. It's one that you hear all the time because I think it's one of her best observations when she said that those who fight for the future live in it today. And another way that you could think about it is that those who are striving toward their greatness are already living, like you're on that path of greatness. You're already living under the shining sun of that greatness, you might say, already just by putting yourself on that path. And I think you and I are both experiencing that in real time as we're doing
Mhm.
this conversation, as we're doing this project. And I hope that we're just even inspiring more people to do it in their own way. And maybe that even takes us to what our call to action is this time around.
Yeah, well, before we get to that, I just would close on it and say that to me, that we've said it before that it's greatness is to us is the ultimate so what of freedom, but it really that sixth point about that it is the ultimate form of freedom. Like that is why we even are championing a free society, why we're philosophical liberals ultimately, is that because this is the incredibly magnificent life that we get to live as human beings, of the truly limitless potential that we have. It's not just kind of a bumper sticker slogan. The whole purpose of sketching out greatness is so that we can take it beyond, kind of cheap slogans or kind of symbols, and really understand and identify what does it take and what does it mean, but what can be. And that freedom is so critical to that. So in many ways, greatness is our North Star by which we want to build a freer society to enable all of us to achieve.
You could almost answer that why greatness matters is for the sake of freedom. Maybe that's the teaser for where we're going.
That is, yep, it is a teaser because our next episode will be the question of why does freedom, flourishing, and greatness matter, and how do they intersect with each other? So we'll dive into this even more. I think we've given some great hints and kernels along the way, but we're going to tie it all together in the next one. And then our call to action in the meantime, as we close it out, is now that we've put forth our grand, great master theory of greatness, we would love to hear what you think is missing, or what you would add or subtract or just change about our theory to make it even greater.
Mhm. And hopefully, even drawing on some of your own experience. I think we hope that you're going to be inspired by this to go seek more greatness yourself, and then let us know what you think we got right and how you think we can make our theory of greatness that much greater than it already is.
Awesome. Great conversation. Look forward to seeing everybody next time.
Yes, can't wait.